Hello, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us. Today, we have an excellent panel discussion on the fundamentals of investigative interviews. Before we get into that discussion, let's quickly cover some logistics. If you get disconnected at any time, just please rejoin using the same link that you originally used to log in. Your microphone is muted. You can submit questions at any time using the Q&A button. We've already received a lot of questions from the audience, and we will address as many as we can. But please keep them coming in if you have questions about what the panel is saying. Finally, this webinar is being recorded, and we will circulate a link to that recording for you to view on demand. It will be just a couple business days. As you can see from our discussion slide, we have a pretty robust discussion ahead of us. This webinar is being presented by Topo AI and our friends at Forensics. Forensics provides an online automated interview platform, and organizations use the Forensics platform for many purposes, including pre-employment screenings, ongoing integrity assessments, employee investigations, and more. My company, Topo AI, provides a critical event management and incidents platform called Topo One. Topo One aggregates threat intelligence and asset data from many sources into a single system for situational awareness, coordinated responses, and incident management. Topo One empowers security professionals to immediately respond to threats and critical events. Our customers rely on our platform for a wide variety of security use cases, including investigations. And customers such as McKesson and the NFL achieve significant gains in productivity, efficiency, and response time. My name is Andrew Saluk, and I'm your host today. It's my pleasure to introduce our panel. First, we have Alan Sequela. He's a professor of interview and interrogation techniques at the Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University. He previously served as a director of security and investigations at Cox Communications, and he has more than 25 years of experience. Welcome, Alan.
Thank you.
We've also got Dr. Andy Niner. Andy is a professional of psychological science at Kennesaw State University and has 40 years of experience developing employment tests. And we're delighted to have you here today, Andy. Thank you.
Thank you.
And finally, last but not least, we've got Russ Law. Russ Law is an executive vice president at Forensics. He previously served as a corporate security advisor for ExxonMobil Global Security and has 22 years of experience. Thank you so much for joining us today, Russ.
Thank you, Andrew. Pleasure to be here.
Great, we're very happy to have all of you. So as we were preparing for this broadcast, one of the concepts we discussed was how investigative interviews are a blend of art and science, and we're going to address both those perspectives on this broadcast. And today's discussion is really geared toward techniques and approaches to fact-finding. And so some of the points we're making are going to be relevant for investigations. Some are more relevant for screening or prevention of some of these ongoing personnel risks that we face. And some are going to be relevant to both of those. So we're really looking at investigative interviews holistically as a tool for discovery. And so we want to provide actionable insights for the audience. We have a diverse audience on today's call based on the registrations, and I'd like to better understand how investigations fit into everyone's professional role. So let me take a quick audience poll. Can the audience please describe how investigations fit into your responsibilities? Select A if they're your primary responsibility. B, if they're a consistent, regular responsibility, among others. C, if you conduct or participate in investigations upon occasion as the need arises. D, if they're not part of your responsibilities. Select option E for other, or if it's not applicable. We'll give everybody just a moment there. Okay, thanks everybody for participating. We've got, as we expected, a pretty diverse audience. Most commonly, investigations are a consistent, regular responsibility. And then number two, we've got people that conduct or participate in investigations upon occasion. So I think what we can take from that is that not everybody is involved in investigations 100% of the time. And so we'll try to tailor our comments appropriately. So one way I think we can start this broadcast, let's maybe talk about the different people that an investigator may need to interview as part of an investigation. Primary suspects, witnesses, maybe others with relevant information, accusing witnesses. Alan, I'm wondering if you could please explain how you might approach some of these different subjects.
Andrew, that's a great question. So depending on the type of case and what you're working on, And I always tell my students in class, there's no substitute for a good investigation prior to conducting any sort of interview. As part of an investigation, you're going to be interviewing witnesses, victims, ultimately the suspect. And of course, those interviews are going to be all very different. So your witness and your victim interviews are going to be more fact-finding, trying to determine what went on, as well as doing some background investigative work prior to actually having or conducting an interview on the suspect. And there's going to be different types of approaches that you would take depending on the case. You know, for example, in a law enforcement interview, it would be normally custodial. So there's going to be a different approach. They may use a factual approach. They may use more of a direct approach. Whereas in a, let's say a corporate investigation, would be more of an emotional approach. And I don't want to go into too aspects of that, but it would, that's pretty much how we look at it from an investigatory standpoint.
I appreciate that, Alan. And you mentioned some of the other sources of information that you would be using as part of an investigation. I'm wondering if Russ might be able to comment on some of these other sources of information you should be gathering before or alongside your investigative interviews.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. And just kind of, adding on to what Alan said, it kind of depends on what the situation is, who you're interviewing, and what the goal of that interview is. And the nice thing is, these days there's a lot as far as tools go. There are a lot of things that you can do to kind of get your hammer bigger before you bring it down in the interview. There's email investigations you can do. You can go look at video, you can look at audio, you can look at point of sale. So there's a lot of background information you can get before you ever get to the interview room. And the more you can get, the more you should get. Because the whole point of the interview, whether it is a candidate for employment, or whether it is a victim, or whether it's a witness, or whether it's somebody who you believe did something they shouldn't be doing, is discovery. And so it has to be a conversation, and it has to have the right feel to it, and you have to build the right rapport, but you also have to come in with the proper background information that you need. Because if you don't, and you sit down across from somebody and you start talking to them and you don't have your ducks in a row, it's going to be a pretty unproductive conversation. That's
really helpful, Russ. And just to maybe put that question over to Alan again. Alan, you mentioned this importance of the emotional approach in a corporate setting. Would you, if you were conducting an investigation, would you be taking the sort of data points that Russ has just described and using those to formulate your emotional approach, or are you using maybe other factors to give you that emotional approach?
Yeah, Andrew, no, and Russ, thanks for pointing that out. The development of a case, or prior to the interview, you're going to be looking at a lot of things. You're looking at the motivation. What was the reason this person might have did what they did? As part of that motivation, you're going to create what we call rationalizations, and giving the person reasons why you believe they did it. And so by doing that, and you're hoping you'll pick the right rationalization. So for example, let's say the motivation is the person embezzled some money from your company in order to pay for their college tuition, or possibly get their car repaired so they could go to work. If we found that in a background check, as you're looking through, and what I like to call working up a motivation checklist, looking at the biography of the person's background and what might have motivated the embezzlement, you're going to develop that information. And then as part of the introductory statement in the emotional interviewing approach, you would offer those rationalizations. And generally, a person who is has taken the money or embezzled for that reason, they're going to bite. They're going to align with you. You're building rapport. You're modeling and you're mirroring their behavior. They're going to when you finally ask them the question, which in the emotional approach we call it an assumptive question. So you would say, when was the last time you took money from the company, versus did you from the company. And then they're going to hesitate. And then of course you'd follow up with, was it yesterday? And of course, then the investigation or the interview continues on. That's basically an admission. But generally with that emotional approach, there's several steps that we follow, but probably the most critical part is based on what Russ said. And that is getting as much information about the investigation, the motivation of what motivated this particular person to do what they did.
That's really, really helpful, Alan. Thank you. And thank you, Russ, too. And so one inherent aspect of these investigative interviews is the ability to detect deception. And this is a topic we can explore in depth today. I'd love to tap into Andy's knowledge on the topic. Andy, I'm wondering if you might please be able to provide an overview of some of the frequently used methods for detecting deception in the employment context. And then just if you have any insights on what the research tells us about detecting deception.
Yeah, sure. In the employment context, the most commonly used method is an interview method. Other deception detective methods, such as the polygraph or mechanical measures, are generally outlawed in employment situations. There are some exceptions. So the cognitive interview is the most often one. And the theory behind it is that people behave differently in observable ways when they're telling the truth versus trying to deceive. And through training, try to get people to recognize what those behavioral cues are through that indicate there's possible deception and how to interpret them. And also the type of questions you ask and the manner you ask the questions should, more likely to elicit deceptive behavior if it's there. So the effectiveness of it really relies heavily on the skill of the interviewer. Overall, the research tells us in general, we're not very good at detecting liars. That it does require a lot of skill, require a lot of training. And there's also a lot of misconceptions or kind of stereotypes that people hold on what they believe are indicators of whether someone is telling the truth or not. A common example is most people believe that people who are trying to lie or trying to be deceptive won't look you in the eye. Or they won't hold a gaze very long. Interestingly enough, the research has kind of debunked that theory. So a lot of the research really is focused on what are those reliable cues that you look for when you're conducting an interview. And what are those observable behavioral differences that people display when they're telling the truth versus when they're not telling the truth.
And would you be able to perhaps elaborate on some of those other cues,
Sure.
whether verbal or nonverbal? Thank you.
Yeah, the ones that, have consistently showed up in the interview and, people really should be trained to look for is when people who are trying to deceive tend to provide fewer details. When you ask them to describe an incident or describe a situation, what happened, they're very sketchy in the details, and the amount of information they provide is relatively less than when people are telling the truth. And the stories they tell tend to be less compelling. They don't, oftentimes they're not very plausible and they don't make sense. The statements they're saying may be inconsistent and, looking for that. Again, as I said, the research does not support the use of eye contact or how often you hold a gaze. That just hasn't been supported. And that truth tellers tend to be more cooperative in the interview. So they're more cooperative, they have fewer negative statements. People that are tending to deceive have a lot of complaints or negative statements in their answers. And you can also pick up in general, people just have a more friendly or pleasant facial expressions when they're telling the truth. And also the liars tend to be more tense. They tend to come across being more nervous. They're more vocally tense. They may speak in a higher pitch. In fact, their eyes tend to be more dilated. And other things are they're less likely to admit any errors, such as that they do lack a memory, or to correct themselves or admit that they had said something that was incorrect. And there's some things that are a little more nuanced when you look at the language that they use. They tend to use more of a passive voice than the active voice, and speak more in the future or past tense as opposed to the present tense. So there's an awful lot that, the researchers have demonstrated in general. These are kind of cues of deception, and, how well someone can pick up on those. And it takes a lot of practice and a lot of experience, more likely they are to really, determine, is this person, what they're telling us, is that truthful or not?
That's really, really helpful, Andy. I would like to move this question over to our seasoned investigators on the call. I wanted to clarify one point I think you made. I believe you mentioned that we were not particularly good at detecting deception.
Right.
And you noted the impact of training. We can talk about training a little bit later in the broadcast. But are you also saying that people who are in compliance roles or in roles where they need to interview people, are those folks also not particularly good at detecting deception without training?
Well, surprisingly, they're not much better than the general population. And there's been a lot of research in this area, and a lot of people who have reviewed all the research and found out what is consistently found. And for the general population, we barely do above chance level. And those who, go through training and are professionals, it really depends on the quality of the training that they go through. The best professions I typically found are Secret Service agents. And, those that have had, in law enforcement or that have gone through the training and are very experienced. But oftentimes, just the fact that someone is in law enforcement, or even in, psychiatry or psychology, others where you expect them, and, the research says we're just not very, very good at it.
I appreciate you sharing those insights. So a couple of takeaways immediately. It seems training is extremely important, and also that investigations can't just swing on one's ability to determine whether or not their subject is lying. So the importance of gathering evidence from so many different sources. So just to broaden the discussion a little bit, I'm wondering if Russ might be able to share any examples from your career, Russ, where you used effective interviews as part of a successful investigation.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. And just to add on a little bit to what Andy said, the training and the experience of the interviewer does mean an awful lot. But, the kind of catch-22 there is, even the most trained and most experienced investigators, it really depends on who they're interviewing as to whether or not they're able to understand whether that person is being honest. And so you do have to lean on other tools and supplement things with technology. And that's the reality. The other reality is that in the real world, training for investigators is wildly divergent. And I know in my own personal experience, when I was working for ExxonMobil, I got thrown into a case, pretty much green, and it was a $40 million information brokering fraud. And so the nice thing was I had a really amazing mentor who led me through that and who led that investigation. And I got to understand, what the best practices were. And that's my roundabout long answer of, getting to your question, Andrew, in that the best results I've seen come from sticking to a process. Whatever that process is, if you found something that works, stick to it and make sure that you do follow that process and don't take shortcuts. I mean, my background being at Exxon, it's a company of engineers. And so regardless of what you do for that company, you deal in process. So, that was, my kind of experience of what can go right. And, that one case that I was talking about, it had a lot to do with following that process of that really experienced investigator and me understanding, why he did what he did, why he asked what he asked, why he chose to interview this person before that person, before that person. And, it's kind of all these things that added up, but it was following that process. So that's an example of what I would say would be a good outcome. I'm looking forward to the counterpart to this question where we can talk about the not so good outcomes, because investigative interviews have a lot of moving parts, and there are a lot more opportunities for something to go wrong than for you to follow that one path that gets you where you need to go, which is the truth.
That's well put. And Alan, I'm wondering if you might be able to share any situations from your career where effective interviews or maybe processes Russ alluded to produced a successful investigation.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Andrew, and also Russ. One of the things that I found in my last company was we worked together as a group. So it was an investigation council, if you will, and we met every 2 weeks on a call, and we would review all the cases. And so we had members of compliance, human resources, legal, and also IT if they needed to be involved, the cyber guys, and sometimes it was a certified fraud examiner on board. So the most successful investigations are when you collaborate on an investigative team and you're using those resources. So in like an embezzlement type case, you're going to use your certified fraud examiner to build that case for you. You're going to use your cyber guy to do the forensics on the laptop or the computer or the device in which we believe was used. You're going to have compliance engaged and HR and legal involved to make sure we're following the guidelines, procedures, and policies. Once we have all agreed upon, okay, we're ready, at that point, the corporate security team, a member of my team, would do the interview with the individual. One of the things that makes it effective, of course, you have a very robust investigation before you go in and have that interview. So those tend to be most successful when you have an investigation involving 1 or 2 or 3 people involved. And so more complex investigations where you have, let's say, scores, potential suspects, that's a whole nother topic. And like Russ said, we could talk about that because those can go bad pretty quickly.
I think that's a pretty excellent segue into that the counterpoint question of things that have gone wrong. And so, Russ, let's go over to you. Do you have any of the horror stories to share, and maybe more importantly, what you learned from them or what they taught you?
Well, I've got a few, so I'm kind of trying to decide, which ones to choose from. I think a lot of times it does come down to the human element of, investigators are human, just like the interviewees are human. And so there are certain things that, can make for a different environment if you have a different interviewee, or if you even have a different setting, or if it's a different time of day, or if you have emotional involvement. And one great example is, if you're going in to interview a key suspect and your wife calls you ahead of time and says, hey, there was a huge leak in the basement. You're like, well, I can't stop what I'm doing now. I've got to go ahead and do this thing that I need to do. But now this whole time in the back of my mind, I know that there's something else that I have to deal with. And so, you're going to perform differently that way. And I think, that's a big reason why technology is something that is a necessity to lean on and to supplement. Another example of one that I think is more and more common lately is, I've participated in a Zoom interview investigation in which the interviewee only spoke French. And so had a translator. The translator was translating the questions, then translating the answers, and the interviewee had a tendency to be a bit chatty. And so, it went off the rails really fast where, we're trying to get a direct answer to a question, but, it's going down all these roads that you didn't anticipate. I've had people during interviews say, hey, why are you writing all this stuff down? And, if you forget to set the stage appropriately, or if you forget to, let them understand why it is you're having this conversation to begin with, if there's every little step, can potentially lead you down a road you don't want to go on. And that's why I keep coming back to technology, and I keep coming back to process. And that's kind of my own preference and my own experience leading me there. But I know Alan has some great stories as well.
Alan, that's a pretty high bar. Would you care to share one or more of those stories?
Yeah, I would. And so the human element has a major impact on the success of an investigation. So, Russ gave an example of the wife calling when there was a flood in the basement, and we've all had those, right? The phone call that comes in. The one that I recall most significantly is when the top of the food chain of the company calls and said, I want a head on a platter. We just lost $1 million. I need to know what the heck's going on. I need you to get your team down there and solve it. And this happened to be, and I'm not going to mention too much detail, but it was an investigation that involved several people in a warehousing arena. So there was multiple suspects. So, of course, in a distribution center or warehousing type thing, you have a lot of entry points. And if you don't have them properly covered, you don't really know what went on. His expectation was we lost over $1 million inventory in this very short period of time. He wanted it solved because it was customer impacting. We weren't able to get the product to the customer. So he didn't care that it was going to take us some time to do all those things we talked about, do the investigation, the workup, pull some evidence before you go down there. He wanted us to start talking to people right away, which when you get pushed to do something, when you're not ready, okay, so you can see right away what's going to happen. You bring some investigators in that are not as skillful. Maybe they don't have the expertise in that area, and then we start talking to people, trying to get an idea of what happened. You don't have enough information. You're not getting anything, and you may not solve it. You're going to alienate some people, not to mention upset the apple cart and all the different business partners you traditionally have had great relationships with could potentially be impacted. And so in that particular case, that's exactly what happened. We did not solve the case. We certainly shook up the place and caused quite a bit of disruption, but we didn't solve it. And maybe the only benefit that came out of it is we were able to get some additional capital to put some better equipment and CCTV in there to prevent it from reoccurring, but we never solved it. And so those types of situations where you're getting pressure from the top to do an investigation and they want it solved yesterday and they don't care, you're going to have to be, I guess you have to be strong enough to say, wait a second, we're going to need to do a little more work. In a case like that, certainly technology would have helped. And of course, I'd like to hear more about forensics and their product later on. You can maybe tell us about how something like that could have helped solve that situation without a lot of disruption.
That's a very good point, Alan. We definitely will address that topic related to technology and related to forensics and what that platform does. I do want to touch on one topic first, and that's this notion of, we've talked about how we're not necessarily very good at, say, detecting deception. So training is really important. And it seems like there's room for improvement at many organizations. Without casting stones at anybody, we can all get better at investigations, especially in these high pressure situations like you described, Alan. And so, Andy, you mentioned training a little bit earlier in the broadcast. I wondered if you had any additional comments on what the research says about training our abilities to detect deception.
Yeah, sure. One of the things that research has shown is there's a lot of bad training programs out there. And there's a lot of bad advice. I know if you go to YouTube videos, hundreds of videos of people telling you how you can spot liars, and probably as many books on it. But the research indicates that to really develop those skills and to be accurate, the training program, really has to be based on research. The behavioral cues that you're looking for have to be ones that, research has shown there's a high correlation with deceptive behavior. It has to involve practice, and feedback. So you're not going to learn those skills by watching a video or reading a book. That's the bottom line. Interesting enough, people have found that it's easier to train naive individuals than those who've had previous training. And a lot of times the training wasn't very good, but people bring to that baggage, and they're in a situation where they have to unlearn a lot before they're open to learn new things. And overall interesting finding is training seems to be more effective for detecting lies that are related to non-transgressions, such as people lying about how they feel about something or their opinion about something, versus transgressions, which is actual, actions. Did you do it or didn't you do it? And I guess the recommendations for organizations when it comes to this is don't try to train managers or in-house staff to be Columbo. Don't train them, in trying to, detect deception. Leave that up to the professionals. So when you have an employment interview, which all supervisors and managers conduct, and HR professionals, it's most of the time people just use their intuition or gut feeling. And instead of trying to focus on is someone telling the truth or not in an employment interview, it's probably not going to be worth your effort to try to train them in lie detection.
That's a really good point, Andy, and it actually kind of sets up one of the things I wanted to discuss, which was, so when you're thinking about an employment interview, pre-employment interview, one of the things you're ultimately trying to do is see, hey, are they going to be a good fit here? Another thing may be to screen for some of these counterproductive workplace behaviors that could result in harassment, loss, liability. And so, Alan, I know in pre-employment screening, one of the most commonly used tools is criminal background checks. And you shared with me they don't really enough. And I hope I'm not misquoting you, but I would love to give you the chance to elaborate on that statement.
Absolutely. And Andy, thanks for leading me into this. So, criminal background checks are something that employers have been doing forever, but they're not really good predictors of future behavior. What you're finding also, there's a lot of states around the country that have eliminated the box on the application, have you been convicted of a crime? Some states have limited the distance you can go back and look on a background check. Some states have limited the types of crimes you can hold against a person and reject them for employment. So they're becoming very, very restrictive. And I'm talking to my peers across the industries, across the nation. Some companies are looking to go away from criminal background checks and going to other screening tools because they're no longer as effective as they have been. The thing is, it's like anything. It's hard to give up a habit. This is something we've done for decades, And so what do you do? What is the next step? But criminal background checks are not as productive as probably most of us wish they were, or know that they can be, or have not been.
That's really helpful. And so just based on some of the concepts we've discussed today, we've seen, training can be, so criminal background checks probably not going to be effective at addressing your ongoing personnel risks, at least comprehensively. you might be able to screen out somebody with a assault conviction or particularly a robbery or fraud, but that's a very tiny number of people.
Yeah, you know, Andy,
Go ahead.
I was one thing, sorry to cut you off. You know, in my last employer, we investigated, thousands of cases in the time I was there. And just to illustrate the whole thing about criminal background checks, every employee we investigated and terminated from my past employer passed the criminal background check. So that just gives you an idea how effective they are.
That's a really compelling point. And that's probably one many members of the audience can relate to. And so training can be effective in certain instances, but it's not training for everybody. You can't train your HR folks to be Columbo, as Andy put it. And Russ, you've mentioned the need to rely on technology for conducting these interviews or as part of your investigations. So can you share some of your thoughts on the problems that some of these technologies help investigators solve, and maybe some of the benefits they get out of using technologies like forensics?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Andrew. So, I mean, I think it's a really important key part of this conversation that, the pre-employment aspect of it, because potentially every investigation you conduct is something that was missed in the onboarding part of the process. And so, but the reality is, at least in my experience, that typically the people involved in the onboarding process are human resources, and they're not nearly as trained and not nearly as experienced in the types of interviews that you would need to conduct to understand counterproductive behaviors. When people are personally involved in counterproductive behaviors, when they have unethical attitudes or forgiving attitudes towards those types of behaviors. And so you end up missing quite a bit by just relying on something like a background check, which is pretty much the go-to. The whole purpose of creating forensics and the forensics automated online interview is that, we basically created a technology I wished was around 20 years ago when I was doing investigations. And that, there's a lot of technologies that you can rely on, but they're more on kind of the background investigation side. You can rely on video surveillance, you can rely on audio, you can rely on point of sale, all those things I mentioned earlier, even, the forensics email investigations that Alan mentioned. But, there's sometimes when you just don't have that. You didn't have, like Alan didn't have the right video surveillance in the investigation he was talking about, where his executives wanted a head on a platter. One of the investigations that I had into a laptop that was stolen with super proprietary information on it, the video camera at the entrance to that area was a dummy camera. And so I go and I start looking for the video evidence and it's just not there. And so it all came down to the interviews at that point, because that was the only way of getting what I needed. And so the whole point behind forensics is that it reduces that disruption that investigations cause on the front end from an interview perspective, because you generally know when you get an incident in, and when something occurs, you get a report through the anonymous tip line, or an employee submits an allegation. Okay, I'm going to have to follow up on this, because if I don't, I start to lose credibility and I start to potentially impact morale. And so I need to get off the starting line pretty quick. Otherwise, it's going to have reverberations throughout the organization. So the whole purpose of forensics is to take that piece of technology that hasn't really been implemented and offered to investigators, which is the investigative interview, and automate the parts of it that can be automated based on 100 different academic studies. And those studies are studies into things like what Andy was speaking about, like behavioral cues, like presenting feedback at the right time, setting the stage for what it is we're going to ask. And so the way forensics works to do that, it's an online platform. The interviewee is presented with questions about different types of counterproductive behaviors, and they receive feedback. They receive those different types of messages that they need to throughout the interview. And the nice thing is, I think I mentioned before, one of some of the bigger cases I've worked on, you have to interview people in a certain order because I can't be copied. And I don't know that my investigator skills are going to be complementary to my colleagues. And so there's some cases where I need to conduct each interview, and it's mutually exclusive when they can be done. The nice thing about forensics is you can have as many of these done as you need when you need it. And so it really does, take away a lot of that time that's wasted, trying to schedule interviews, developing reports, employee time off the shop floor. And it's a way of really being able to narrow down where you want to go next, and potentially even identifying a suspect right off the bat. So that's probably a good overview. I don't want to get too much into the weeds on that, but I am a big proponent of technology in general. I mean, even when I was a young buck working at Exxon and didn't have any gray hairs, I recognized right in that there were things we could improve with technology in the corporate security group, with incident reporting and things like that. So I've always been a proponent of this. And I feel like, technology is one of those things that, it kind of lets you stand on the shoulders of giants, and I think probably the best analogy that I can give you is QuickBooks. When QuickBooks was introduced, if I'm an accountant, I might be worried that I'm not going to have a job in a few years. But the reality is, if I'm an accountant now, I have just as much, if not more clients than I had when I started, when QuickBooks was introduced, because I can do more with the same amount of resources. And that's the whole point of technology, is being able to do more with the same amount of resources and do it in a more efficient, consistent, and standardized way.
Russ, I really appreciate that. And I think the QuickBook analogy was really appropriate. I want to touch on one other discussion topic before we get to the audience question and answer session. And thanks to the audience for sending in all these great questions too. Keep them coming and we'll get to as many as we can. So Alan, you had mentioned this concept of the team investigation and of using people from different roles within the organization to get to the bottom of some big cases. So this tells me we probably need to have good, effective corporate policies to help support those investigations and kind of determine who's responsible for what as part of these investigative teams. So do you have any comments or recommendations on what are the investigative interview or interview policies that organizations should have in place to be able to conduct effective investigations?
Yeah, absolutely, Andrew. So, in every corporation, they're going to establish, especially the larger ones, what those policies are. So traditionally, certain types of investigations are led by the security or loss prevention professionals. Other types that deal more with the human aspects, such as, I would say behavioral type issues tend to be that fall into human resources side. And so those decisions have got to be broken out. In my last company, we actually highlighted the types of investigations that would be led by a security team and those by HR and also compliance. So that'll have to be identified within an organization. What we also streamlined is we brought this team together because when you get to those significant cases, especially when it's something that could potentially make it to the media, a situation that could be something that would go all the way to the top of the owners in a publicly traded company, Wall Street. So there has to be some processes, procedures that are identified in advance of conducting any type of investigation, because you do have all those other things to think about, not to mention the regulatory agencies that are going to be looking. So what type of industry you're in. There's some other compliance issues that you may be confronted with. So it's just a matter of working with your HR, your compliance, your regulatory and legal teams to establish process, procedures, and policies on how these investigations should be conducted and who should be doing those investigations. So if you identify that up front, it makes it a lot easier when those investigations occur. For example, just last year at my company, we had 3,000 investigations. That's a lot of work. Most of that was fraud. Of course, there was some significant embezzlement cases, not to mention everything under the sun, sabotage, vandalism, workplace violence, you name it. But every one of those investigations went through a process of being reviewed. And of course, it was handled appropriately according to the procedure and policy.
So it's one takeaway for the audience might be then to segment investigative responsibilities depending on the type of incident or suspected incident.
Oh, yeah, absolutely, Andrew, because as Russ mentioned, HR is very good at conducting certain types of investigations where security is very good at dealing with security related matters such as, let's say, fraud, embezzlement, those types of cases. So you're not going to be wonderful at everything. And like, Andy also mentioned, detecting deception is difficult. And so you do want to use your most skillful people in those types of investigations where they have a history, where they got the training, and where they have the practice and the feedback, like Andy said. So the best investigators are those who actually do the interviews. If you don't do them and you dump it on somebody, they're not going to be successful, and it's going to cause you more problems later on.
That's really helpful.
Build on what Alan is saying and what Russ had said. Russ has talked about the use of technology, and Alan is saying rightly so that really need to leave it up to the professionals. Well, there's only so many professionals, and that's an expensive way. So we're talking about volume, particularly in pre-employment situations. There's going to continue to be more and more reliance on technology just to reduce cost and time. So that's where we're going to see some of the products that forensics has that doesn't require a trained professional to conduct the interview, and uses technology and algorithms and so forth to come up with and analyze some of the behavioral cues and get indications. For example, if you're just asking a kind of in a questionnaire survey format, a number of questions that you would ask in a pre-employment interview, some of the indicators of deception that we find are response latency, or the time to answer a question. The research has shown that lying places more of a cognitive load, or it's more cognitively commanding to generate a lie than it is to tell the truth. So it takes more time. Computers are very good at tracking how long it takes someone to answer a question and do that very accurately. Response consistency. Ask someone the same question twice, do they give the same answer? Or and then the things that are really getting more advanced are things such as mouse movement and eye movement that you can track, and the person responding to the questions on a computer doesn't know these things are being monitored. So if you're asking someone to click on a screen and there's they're answering yes to a question or no, people who tend to lie, again, it takes time to formulate those lies, and you can actually watch a track movement as they're kind of vacillating back and forth between how they're going to answer it. So just in terms of the economy of scale, the consistency, the standardization, technology is people are looking more toward that as an answer, just because of the cost and timeliness of using professionals.
I really, go ahead, Russ.
Sorry, real quick. I think for me, that's Andy hit the nail on the head right there. It comes down to scale. And, you can't scale an individual person investigator. So that's where technology really can make an order of magnitude change. Is if you have an opportunity to scale something with technology, that's where you should implement it.
Okay, thank you. And I appreciate that really informative discussion. I think we should move on to the question and answer session for the audience. Please continue to send them in. But before we get into the audience questions, I have a question that I would like to ask the audience. And that question is, would you like to learn more about technology solutions from forensics or from Topo AI? Select A for both solutions. Select B to learn more about the forensics online automated interview platform. Select C to learn more about the Topo One critical event management platform, or select D to indicate not at this time. We'll leave the poll up for a few more seconds and get into the audience questions and answers. And so one question we've gotten a couple times is there going to be a link to the recording? The answer to that is yes. I'll send it out to the same email addresses that you provided to register for the broadcast, and it will be a couple business days. My aim is to get that out this week. So thanks to everybody for participating in our polling question. So let's just get to these audience questions here. Tips. So we've gotten a question around the intersection between corporate security investigations and law enforcement. And so the one question we received is, can you contrast the two types of investigations? And then a related question there is, do you have any tips for ensuring that evidence you collect during a corporate security investigation will be admissible if necessary in a court of law or regulatory hearing? Let's address that question to Alan first.
Yeah, hey, thanks. Certainly in law enforcement, you have different constraints. Of course, you have the 4th, 5th, 6th, and 14th Amendment. You have Miranda. In a corporate environment, we do not have to read Miranda rights to our people that we're interviewing. So the way you conduct an investigation in a corporate setting is the person that you're interviewing can get up and walk out at any time. In custodial interrogation and law enforcement arena, that's not the case. So there's a lot of similarities in behavior. So when you're doing interviews or an interrogation, whether it be in a custodial law enforcement interview or a corporate setting, in order to get the person to confess, it doesn't matter. I've done both, and I'm a polygraph examiner, so I've done a lot of interrogations, interviews. You have to mirror, model, you have to build rapport the moment you walk in that room, and you're going to have to rationalize what happened, minimize the seriousness of what they've done. And then if you ask them a good question, like an assumptive question, that 50% of the time, if you're a good interviewer, they're going to confess. If not, then you're going to have to go back into re-rationalization and minimization and try to convince them to be truthful with you. So, I noticed there was a question about behavior as well. Again, the behaviors and the interpretation of behavior is something that's learned over time and through a lot of practice and skill. And as I used to teach this class to investigators, you have to slow down, ask the question, which is the stimulus, and wait for the response. Observe and wait. It's kind of like looking back at the video after the case. You can see it afterwards when you step out of the room and you review the video. The issue is when you're in the heat of it, you're going to miss some things. What was the other part of the question, Andrew? I don't know if I answered it all.
Sorry, yeah, it was really long-winded of me, but this is more direct. It's any tips on ensuring that evidence that you collect during a corporate security investigation will be admissible in a court of law or regulatory?
Yes, sir. And again, that goes like with any type of investigation, whether it's law enforcement or not. So in a corporate setting, you're going to handle the evidence with chain of custody, just like you would any other type of law enforcement investigation. You treat it the same way. If you're involving the certified fraud examiner, or you're involving your cyber guys to do forensics, there has to be chain of custody for all that evidence, preparing it, handling it appropriately as you're moving along the chain. A lot of the investigations we do on the corporate side, again, is you're pulling evidence from all different sources. And as you're compiling and containing that, ultimately, once it's prepared, it's going to be delivered for let's say prosecution in a criminal case. And it depends on jurisdiction. Some jurisdictions will allow you to deliver it directly to the DA. Some cases you have to make a police report. Some cases you go in front of a judge and they'll issue a warrant based on your presentation. Really, you're going to have to look at what's required in the jurisdiction in which you're doing the investigation. But evidence should be handled the same way.
So that's really helpful, and actually sets up another question from the audience, and that's is there any guidance on so thinking about evidence and chain of custody and actually getting evidence to maybe outside stakeholders, so or auditors or whomever. Russ, do you have any guidance on how to properly document the results of an interview? Thinking about the effectiveness of your investigation internally, and then maybe other things you might have to do with that information.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, a lot of, especially I would say, well-defined investigations departments or corporate security departments are going to have as part of their process that you really need a second person in the interview in addition to the main investigator and the interviewee so that you have a witness. Because otherwise, you're just working off interview notes. I think with technologies like Zoom, you obviously have, video or video recording of what people have said and audio recordings of what people have said. With forensics, what we implemented is that, we have a documentation that this person answered this question in this way, and then the investigator entered in these notes at this time. And so there's a very clear audit log there. And I think it all comes down to documentation. And most of the time, in my experience, it's got to be a pretty decent sized case for law enforcement to even say, yes, we'd like to pursue that. When you think about the caseloads that they themselves have, it is going to be, I would say, prohibitive for a lot of law enforcement agencies to take on every case that they would like to take on. So if you hand them a $40 million fraud on a platter, they're like, yes, we'd love to close that. But if you say, hey, I've got this guy who stole a couple of $100 out of the till, they're most likely not going to do anything with that, regardless of the amount of documentation you have. So I think a lot of it comes down to expectations. And, quite honestly, in my own experience, only, I would say probably less than 50% of investigations, corporate investigations, even into very defined criminal activities, even get reported to the police, because most of the time, I, as the organization, I want to be done, and I want this person out of my hair.
I really appreciate that real world context. So we've had a couple different questions come in on using Zoom or audiovisual technology. A lot of people are still in a remote working environment. So is there any guidance on how your process or your approach might change if you're doing it over video? And Russ, you gave the French example earlier. Alan, though, could you maybe lead that off? Any advice on conducting investigations through video?
Yeah, it's interesting. That was a topic. The semester just ending. We just covered that on Tuesday. So in all Zoom and even prior to Zoom, we used to do telephone interviews. Whenever possible, do it in person. Zoom, of course, is something we all had to do. But the only advice I would give you is make sure that when you're placing the camera, make sure you have the ability to see from head to toe, because you're going to be looking at body language, verbal and nonverbal. You want to make sure you can see their body. You want to make sure at least you can control the environment. So, for example, if you're going to have to do a Zoom interview, don't let them take the Zoom from their home. Have them go to a different location that's neutral, not their own comfort zone. So, we've done some of those where we take them and say, would you mind driving to this location where there is not going to be any employees? You have a badge, you can swipe in, go into the conference room, we'll get you to set up. So again, you're going to potentially miss some of the things you would see in an in-person interview. But we've done them where we've had the witness in one part of the country, the suspect in another, and the interviewer in another. It's just about placement and making sure you have everything set up when you're actually conducting them.
That's really helpful. And Russ, do you have any other comments on using video for interviews, maybe based on your experience?
I don't think anything other than what Alan's mentioned and what I mentioned before now.
Okay, thank you. And I think we have time to get in one more question here. And this is about dealing with combative individuals. So we discussed a little bit earlier how the investigator experience level and then the subject they're interviewing, that can determine at least the ability to detect deception, maybe other things. So I'm just wondering, let's start with Andy. Andy, do you have any advice, maybe based on your research practice, on speaking with combative individuals?
Yeah, said earlier, the research showed one of the major indicators is cooperation. So obviously a combative individual is not likely to be cooperating with the interviewer. And a very common technique is first of all, not to set it up as a combative environment, that it's very important for the interviewer to come across as I'm on your side. You need to disarm the individual. So a lot of techniques up front in terms of setting a positive tone, getting the person relaxed, coming across as more of as a friendly nature to really disarm them. So someone who's looking for a fight is not going to persist very long when they don't get any resistance or fighting back. So just to sum it up is try to set a positive tone and set yourself up as an interviewer, almost as I'm on your side, I'm here to help you. You need to get those negative emotions down and to gain their trust before you can start getting them to drop their barriers and open up to you.
That's really helpful. And Russ, I saw you nodding. Do you have anything to add to Andy's comments?
No, I mean, I think he's spot on. A lot of it comes down to building a rapport when you are sitting face to face, either across the table or either on a Zoom call. But that's also the nice thing about technology is that it doesn't have to build the rapport. And a lot of times, if somebody admits, in our online interview that they have done something or that they've observed something, it kind of deflates that combativeness that they might have had otherwise, because they've already admitted it and they've already told us, hey, this is what I've seen. So now it's just a matter of saying, okay, well, tell me more. It's not a, did you do this? It's tell me more about that.
I really appreciate that. And Alan, last word to you before we wrap up the broadcast.
Both Andy and Russ are right on with that. It's just, I've had people come in and they were combative in a different way. In other words, they want up getting up on the table and sitting on the table. So how do you deal with that? Versus just getting in your face, or they don't want to sit down. And it's a matter of building the rapport and finding something in common from the time they walk in. And then there's going to be some cases where they'll never come around and they're going to stay that way. And then that's the time you remind them that, the investigation is going to continue with or without your cooperation. And so they can agree to stay and visit with me, or they can leave. But most cases, they come around. And then, of course, you're able to get into the content of the interview.
Okay. I think we've crossed 3 p.m., so I think we'll leave it at that. That brings us to the end of today's broadcast. I'd like to thank Alan Sequella, Andy Niner, and Russ Law for taking part in today's discussion. Great work today, gentlemen. Thank you. And thank you also. I really appreciate the chance to do this and to share this with the audience. And I'd like to also thank the audience for joining us and for sending in all those thoughtful questions. We really hope that this broadcast provided you with some actionable information. We'll continue to host these webinars on a wide variety of security topics. And I do ask that you please take part in the exit survey as you leave the broadcast to let us know how we did today. So on behalf of our panel, we wish everybody good luck with conducting your investigative interviews, and stay safe out there. Goodbye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thanks again, Andrew.
You bet.